Just hours ago, on this tense Friday morning of February 13, 2026, precisely at 4:21 a.m. Eastern Time, a secure line shattered the quiet inside the Pentagon's inner core. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, jolted from thin sleep, lifted the receiver to a familiar yet unnervingly cold voice. The Secretary General of NATO. In clipped, deliberate phrases, he delivered a shock that rewrote 77 years of post-war reality. The European Council, after an all-night emergency meeting, had passed a binding resolution by a landslide, 28 in favor, 2 against, invoking a long-dormant clause of the North Atlantic Treaty. The ultimatum was brutal in its simplicity. The United States had 72 hours to withdraw every American soldier from all NATO installations on European soil, or face formal expulsion from the very alliance it had helped build and lead since 1949. There was a long silence, then the question every senior official hopes never to ask. Is this real? The answer came like ice water. Documentation was already being transmitted to the State Department. This was not a negotiation, only notification. That call, meant to remain buried in secure archives, has already leaked from deep inside Brussels, racing quietly through the inboxes of people who understand just how historic this moment is, even as the major networks, the front pages, and Capitol Hill remain oblivious for a few more hours. What is happening now is not just a diplomatic spat. It is the most consequential rupture in transatlantic relations since NATO's founding, and the alliance that claimed credit for winning the Cold War and preserving peace for nearly 8 decades is not merely fraying at the edges. It is being dismantled in real time. The countdown clock is already running, and unless something extraordinary happens before that deadline hits, the United States will wake up in a world where it no longer sits at the heart of the Western security architecture. This crisis did not appear out of thin air. It is the result of 14 days of cascading decisions, insults, and strategic miscalculations that transformed longtime partners into determined adversaries, with each step recorded in cables, minutes, and internal memos that are now being passed hand to hand among those who know where to look. It began on day 1, when a blunt diplomatic note landed on the desks of officials in Copenhagen. The message demanded that Denmark agree to transfer Greenland to U.S. control within a fixed, brutally short window, or face 100% tariffs on all Danish exports into the American market. Hidden in the fine print was something even more explosive. The offer did not include actual financial compensation. Instead, it talked about canceling what was described as a defense debt Copenhagen supposedly owed Washington, a debt that exists in no treaty, no statute, no binding document whatsoever. It was a demand to surrender territory under duress, dressed up as an accounting adjustment. Day 4 turned that spark into a transatlantic firestorm. In a high-profile television interview, the president claimed that NATO allies had hung back a little off the front lines during the long years in Afghanistan, while American troops did the real fighting and dying. In London, Berlin, Ottawa, and beyond, the reaction was instant and incandescent. But the fury was not limited to statements and indignant press conferences. That same day, a directive emerged from Washington, slashing the American military budget allocated to Ramstein Air Base in Germany by 40%, ordering 120 U.S. personnel to begin packing up with just 30 days' notice. There was no consultation with Berlin, no coordination with NATO command, no attempt to soften the blow, only a unilateral executive decision that undercut the sense of shared burden at the core of the alliance. By day 7, this was no longer simply a war of words or budgets. It was evolving into an existential question about Europe's future security. Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs quietly circulated a classified memorandum to all 27 European Union member states. The subject line was as stark as it was unprecedented: activation of Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon. That clause is the European Union's mutual defense pledge, the closest thing the EU has to its own Article 5. And unlike NATO's version, it does not require American participation. In other words, Poland was openly proposing that Europe prepare to defend itself without the United States. For the first time since the early Cold War, a major European nation was formally raising the possibility that NATO might not be enough, that the American security umbrella might be more liability than asset. The signal was unmistakable. Contingency planning for a post-NATO Europe was no longer think tank fantasy. It was official policy, under discussion in the corridors of power. On day 10, the quiet betrayal came from perhaps the last place many in Washington would expect, London. At the secluded country retreat of Chequers, the British Prime Minister held a discreet, closed-door session with the President of France. Within 48 hours, a leaked transcript began to circulate among journalists and analysts. In that room, the British leader suggested something that would have been dismissed as madness barely half a year earlier. If the United States moved ahead with plans to punish or even expel Denmark from NATO over the Greenland standoff, the United Kingdom would be prepared to withdraw from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement. Five Eyes, the deep, decades-old partnership binding the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, has been the crown jewel of Western signals intelligence since the Second World War. Walking away from it would be like tearing out part of the alliance's nervous system. In exchange, Britain would commit to a new arrangement sometimes whispered about in Brussels, a European intelligence union, a framework in which Britain's deepest secrets would be shared not primarily with Langley, but with Brussels and Paris. That one move would tilt the balance of global spying infrastructure away from Washington and toward a continental system designed to function without American primacy. By day 14, the tensions snapped. At 10 p.m. Brussels time, the North Atlantic Council convened an emergency session, summoning representatives from 30 member states. 29 delegations entered the chamber. One seat, the American seat, remained empty. The United States was not invited. Over the next 4 hours, behind closed doors, leaders and envoys debated the unthinkable. According to the official record of that meeting, now quietly circulating among senior staffers, 28 nations voted yes on a resolution titled Suspension of United States Voting Rights Pending Compliance Review. Only 2, Turkey and Hungary, voted no. The legal basis for this move was Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty, a provision that had never once been used in the alliance's 77-year history. Article 13 allows for suspending a member whose actions violate the democratic principles and peaceful dispute resolution commitments that are laid out in Article 1. The formal charge was clear. The President's threat of military force against Denmark, a NATO ally, constituted a material breach of that fundamental principle that disputes between allies must be settled by peaceful means, not coercion. At 3:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Secretary General placed the call to Washington. The United States had 72 hours to comply with the terms set forth by the Council, or face expulsion. That deadline is now less than 3 days away. You might be tempted to say, they can't just kick us out. The United States has nuclear weapons, 100,000 troops on European soil, and the largest economy on the planet. But the machinery for exactly that scenario is already in motion, built step by step over the last several months. The strategy unfolds in 4 stages. Stage 1, the legal pretext, is already complete. NATO's lawyers in Brussels have assembled a meticulously detailed case file. Document 1. Public remarks threatening the use of military force in a territorial dispute with Greenland, which violates Article 1's pledge to resolve international conflicts by peaceful means. Document 2. The unilateral, uncoordinated 40% funding cut and partial drawdown at Ramstein, which violates Article 3's requirement that member states consult on matters affecting collective defense. The legal foundation has been poured and cured. There is nothing theoretical about it anymore. Stage 2 is diplomatic isolation, and that is unfolding as you watch this. The schedule for the next week's security meetings reads like a list of doors slammed in Washington's face. The Munich Security Conference, the premier annual gathering of defense ministers, generals, and security thinkers from across the transatlantic world, is convening without inviting the United States to its core sessions for the first time since the conference began in the early 1960s. In early February, European Union defense ministers are scheduled to meet behind closed doors in Brussels with a single agenda item: post-NATO security architecture. Days later, a trilateral summit between the United Kingdom, France, and Germany will take up the question of a European nuclear umbrella, code for how Europe might replace the American nuclear guarantee that has shielded the continent since the late 1940s. One by one, the diplomatic forums and defense dialogues that once revolved around Washington are being repurposed to design a world in which the United States is not just absent, but deliberately excluded. Stage 3 is economic strangulation, and it carries consequences not just for foreign policy elites, but for every American household. The European Union has quietly prepared a sanctions package they codename Independence. It has been drafted, vetted, and, according to multiple sources, is sitting ready to launch the moment the 72-hour deadline expires without compliance. Under this plan, all American technology exports to the European Union, semiconductors, software, cloud services, hardware, would be hit with 100% tariffs. European banks would be barred from extending credit to American corporations operating inside EU jurisdictions. And then there is the nuclear option, freezing more than $2 trillion in U.S. assets currently parked in European financial systems. If that hammer falls, analysts inside key institutions estimate the dollar could lose 30% of its value in a single day. Inflation in the United States could spike to 15 or even 20% almost overnight. This is not a mild recession scenario. This is a blueprint for an economic freefall on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. Stage 4 is military expulsion. Once a member is suspended under Article 13, the legal protections that shield its bases and forces evaporate. American military installations in Europe would no longer enjoy automatic treaty protection. Host nations would regain full sovereignty over every acre of land, every runway, every pier currently under U.S. control. A leaked plan from the German Ministry of Defense, codenamed Operation Charlemagne, lays out how this would unfold. Germany would nationalize Ramstein Air Base, the largest U.S. installation outside of American territory, and give 35,000 service members 90 days to depart. Turkey would close Incirlik Air Base, which currently hosts American nuclear weapons. Poland would seize billions of dollars of pre-positioned NATO equipment on its territory. Across Europe, military police units have been quietly repositioned near American facilities over the last 2 weeks, ready to move in the instant the deadline passes without a negotiated retreat. But the truly terrifying part is not just the loss of bases or even the collapse of NATO. It is what happens in the hours and days after America is pushed out of the alliance. Beijing is watching every move, running its own calculations. The Pentagon's entire strategy has been built around a two-front assumption that the United States can fight in Europe and Asia simultaneously. That assumption depends on forward-deployed forces and bases in both theaters. Strip away European basing rights, and the United States faces a brutal choice: defend Europe or defend Asia, but not both at once. Internal assessments suggest that 60% of the U.S. Navy currently assigned to the Atlantic and Mediterranean would need to redeploy toward the Pacific to maintain credible deterrence against China. That redeployment would take months. During that window, the United States would be stretched dangerously thin in both regions. A recent classified wargaming report focusing on NATO dissolution and Taiwan contingency timelines concludes that if NATO collapses, Washington will lack the naval and air assets to reliably defend Taiwan from a full-scale Chinese invasion. The estimated window for Chinese action, once thought to be around 2030, collapses forward to 2027. Meanwhile, a freshly inked EU-India trade agreement contains a clause stating that signatories will remain neutral in conflicts that do not directly affect European territory. Neutral. That means that if China moves on Taiwan and Washington calls on its European partners for support, those partners could point to that clause and say no. They would sit on the sidelines, citing neutrality, while Japan and South Korea, dependent on the U.S. security umbrella, panic. At the same time, Europe's nuclear security is thrown into chaos. Under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Turkey currently host around 150 American warheads. If the United States is expelled, those weapons must be removed. Only France and the United Kingdom possess their own independent nuclear arsenals. A leaked memo from the French presidential palace proposes extending a French nuclear umbrella over all European Union members, but only if Germany, Italy, and others agree to fully fund France's nuclear program going forward, at an annual cost estimated in the tens of billions. Berlin's response, delivered through discreet channels, is a sharp refusal, calling the idea a form of fiscal blackmail. That refusal opens a security vacuum that Russia is perfectly placed to exploit. With NATO fractured, American troops gone, and nuclear guarantees in flux, Anxious leaders in Eastern Europe envision Russian forces probing the defenses of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, testing how far they can push without American boots on the ground or a credible nuclear backstop. All of this is not speculation in a vacuum. It is drawn from war games and scenario planning that Western militaries have been running in secret for months. Inside the White House, senior officials have fed this data into simulations, played out the timelines, and reached a grim conclusion. The president has three options on the table, and each one ends badly. Option 1, preemptive withdrawal, the "you can't fire me, I quit" strategy. According to sources close to the inner circle in Florida, the president has seriously considered announcing that the United States will withdraw from NATO before it can be formally expelled, framing it as a bold move to stop subsidizing ungrateful allies. The executive order to make that happen reportedly already exists in draft form. If that order is signed, markets are expected to react with sheer panic. The stock market could plunge by 40% within days, the dollar could lose half its value, and inflation could skyrocket to levels not seen since the worst days of interwar Europe. This would be a self-inflicted economic catastrophe. Option 2, economic warfare, an attempt to reverse the sanctions pressure. An internal Treasury Department memorandum outlines a response package that would slap 200% tariffs on all European Union goods entering the United States, freeze hundreds of billions in European assets inside American banks, and attempt to cut Europe off from key financial messaging systems where Washington still holds significant influence. The theory is that if Europe suffers enough economic pain, it will come back to the table. The flaw is obvious. This sort of strategy requires allies. In the past 2 weeks, China, India, and major Asian bloc nations have signed or deepened trade deals with the EU. They are not going to join Washington's sanctions crusade. They are far more likely to side with Brussels. If Washington fires this financial shot, it risks sanctioning itself, as American exporters lose access to the world's largest consumer market, while European firms pivot their trade toward Asia. Option 3 is the most perilous, a military standoff. In this scenario, the president orders the approximately 100,000 American troops stationed in Europe not to leave, even if the deadline expires. U.S. bases on European soil are declared sovereign American territory, and any attempt by host nations to assert control is branded an act of war. European contingency planning documents describe the likely reaction. German and Polish forces would move to encircle key U.S. bases, cutting off electricity, water, and food deliveries, turning those installations into islands under siege. The goal would not be to launch an immediate attack, but to create a slow-burning humanitarian crisis that forces Washington to reconsider. The nightmare, of course, is that in the tension and confusion at a perimeter fence or checkpoint, a single nervous soldier on either side fires a shot. That one shot could escalate into an exchange of fire, then a firefight. Suddenly, American and European soldiers are shooting at each other, two democratic militaries locked in open conflict. The alliance does not simply dissolve, it ends in blood. Now, here's the most chilling layer. According to a source inside the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have already sent a classified memorandum to the president, urging him not to retaliate in any of these ways. The memo reportedly warns that economic retaliation on the scale being discussed would collapse the U.S. economy, that a military confrontation with European allies would amount to a civil war inside NATO, and that preemptive withdrawal would annihilate U.S. credibility for an entire generation. Behind the scenes, there are whispers that senior military and civilian officials have quietly discussed emergency scenarios under the 25th Amendment, which provides a mechanism for removing a president deemed unable to discharge the duties of office. Several cabinet members, it is said, have already spoken with the vice president about whether ordering a military strike or aggressive action against Europe could constitute a form of incapacity. There is no precedent for these conversations. They are taking place in real time, in hushed offices and encrypted calls, as the 72-hour clock ticks toward zero. 14 days ago, all of this began with what looked like just another insult hurled in an interview about Afghanistan. It escalated with a threat over Greenland. Now, with less than 3 days remaining on the ultimatum, the world is staring at the possible collapse of the Atlantic Alliance, the potential removal of a sitting American president under constitutional emergency powers, and a looming global power vacuum that China and Russia are eager to fill. If you are still watching, you are ahead of the curve. You are seeing the pattern before the headlines catch up. The question that hangs over everything tonight is brutally simple. Should the United States cling to NATO at any cost, even under a leader who threatens allied nations? Or is Europe justified in taking the most drastic step imaginable to protect itself? Or is the deeper truth that both sides have miscalculated so badly that we are witnessing the beginning of the end of the Western order as we have known it for generations?